Bass drum sounds are a surprisingly divisive issue on the internet, in music, and today we're going to explain to you why yours is wrong, but also they're all wrong. What we say when we talk about a wrong sound is kind of nonsense anyway, because it's not the sound's fault. We're just making a sound. Context is what decides whether or not a sound is appropriate. Let's not say right and wrong anymore. Let's consider the possibility of just more or less appropriate. We want to use appropriate and inappropriate specifically because sometimes an inappropriate sound can be excellent for creating tension, thus giving us the opportunity for tension and release in the music and do something innovative rather than getting balled up in the idea that we're not allowed to do that. Today, we're going to move through a couple of different tunings, 3 in fact, that fit more or less effectively into a few different styles of playing, and we're going to take apart why one is allegedly the right one or the wrong one for each. Each of the demonstrations you're going to hear are essentially the same beat, but we're going to move through 3 different sounds so that you can hear exactly what is good and exactly what is challenging by utilizing those sounds within that musical context. Like with just about everything in music, never forget that this is all subjective. Your opinion is yours. Everyone who watches this is going to have a slightly different opinion. So let's try to keep our beginner's mindset going here, listen objectively, and consider the sound in a vacuum, and to the degree that you can, leave your baggage behind. Before we jump into the context examples, let's hear each of these sounds in a vacuum by themselves so we can get a good comparison. Without diving into semantics too much, we are moving from dead to boomy, with one in the middle that splits the difference. Some of the factors that go into these choices beyond the music could also include whether or not you're going to choose to or be married to burying the beater, and also how hard you're going to be hitting the drum versus how softly you might be hitting the drum in the same context. Important public service announcement moment. If you listen to these demonstrations and all you take away is which one's your favorite and which one you hate, then you've already lost the battle when it comes to broadening your palette and understanding that sound and context go hand in hand. Let's try to listen with fresh ears and set all of those opinions aside. All right, let's move on to the context examples. Here comes example number 1. The first thing that we talked about here before we recorded this is that we wanted an example that included some busy bass drum playing, maybe a little burying of the beater, digging in pretty hard, and wanting to hear articulation in between each of the notes. With a really low-tuned and essentially unresonant bass drum, this gives us a lot of power in heavy genres, and particularly situations where there's a lot of really low-tuned guitar and bass frequencies happening that we need to cut through with the click of the beater, with a little bit of low end underneath, but punchiness being the most important factor. As we add air and room and sustain to that sound, it punches through a little bit less and starts to become part of the collective low end, which, depending on the context, could be cool or could be a little bit more challenging. Let's move on to example number 2. It's easy enough to sit in the school of thought that a genre or a style or a certain sort of music demands a certain sort of sound. However, if we go down that road, that means that we're only going to do more of the same and take out the possibility that we could innovate. Reaching for sounds that come from a different genre or seem, as we said before, inappropriate actually opens the door to the possibility of some kind of sonic innovation, and also an opportunity for you to dial in a voice that's more your own if you prefer those sounds, rather than just towing the line and doing exactly what's expected. Let's move on now to the third example. With this example, we're intentionally making a tremendous amount of space for the drum to speak if it's tuned in such a way that it has sustain and a longer voice. This is a great example of an opportunity to consider the idea that your drum has the possibility for sustain, and we can utilize that if we want to, provided that we make the right tuning, head, and muffling choices. For me, in a song like this, or a environment like this, I would want to have a bass drum sound that had a little bit more sustain, and making choices like removal of the pillow and perhaps using a resonant head with no port will bring us a lot more tone out of the drum, which then we can muffle and adjust with tuning as needed after the fact. This isn't to say that we can't use the tighter sound in this kind of environment. It really depends on what else is going on, and you could really use any of these sounds, again, in any of the examples that we've gone through today. It really depends on the musical environment and your personal taste, and it also depends on getting away from the idea that any of them are wrong. Setting aside the nature of the music that you're playing or the nature of your band, your approach, touch, and feel on the instrument also influences these things. And anytime that you swap out a sound for something different, it's an opportunity to expand that palette and make yourself different by degree from everybody else that's just doing it the old way. If you look back at the history of the drum set, which is barely 100 years old, we see obvious innovations that seem sensible and normal to us because we get to look at them in hindsight. But just because we think of an 18-inch bass drum as the jazz thing, or a 22 as a rock thing, or a 26 as the Zeppelin thing, they didn't start out that way. Somebody made that choice to go against the grain and make a sound that made them happy or fit their music or fit in the trunk of their car. Whatever the reason, now we get to stand on the shoulders of that and do that for ourselves. This conversation today stemmed from another conversation that we had here in the studio about purists, and how for every person that says never muffle your drum, there's someone who says always muffle your drum. And for everybody that says you can never bury the beater, there's somebody that says you need to always bury the beater, which renders both arguments completely meaningless. What we're really talking about here is deifying the instrument, deifying the setup of the instrument, and taking ourselves completely out of the musical relationship we have with using this as a palette, a canvas, a tool for creating music, and understanding that inside of that palette, there's a lot more than tune it just above a wrinkle and put a pillow in there. Something that we have to acknowledge as musicians who play an instrument is that every detail about that instrument can inadvertently turn into a perceived limitation for ourselves, whether it's the lug count, the heads that are on the drum, or what we just intellectually think it's capable of. It's incumbent upon us to make sure we understand that within whatever details you may know about your instrument, there's a lot more going on than you could possibly imagine if only we can set aside our preconceived expectations and go either toward what we think it's capable of or go directly away from it and see how far from expectation we can get. Today we're going to leave you with a challenge, and that is to figure out which one of these sounds was your least favorite. Doesn't matter what the drum dial settings were, doesn't matter what size or shape or heads your drum might have. We want you to make that sound at home, try it out, see how it feels, and understand that you might get inspired, even if it's not your favorite thing after you've done it yourself, but it could take you towards something that you're going to love.